This is Chapter 6, Part A, on bones and skeletal tissues. So initially, the human skeleton contains just cartilage, which later will be replaced by bone during development, except in a few select areas. So remember from Chapter 4 in the tissues, we said cartilage is made up mostly of just water. So there's no blood vessels or nerves. We have a lot of this extracellular matrix, or this water-based matrix. The perichondrium is a layer of dense connective tissue that surrounds the cartilage on either side. So it helps the cartilage to resist any outward expansion, and it will also contain those blood vessels to deliver nutrients to the cartilage, since the cartilage doesn't have its own blood vessels. The cells in cartilage are called chondrocytes, and they're contained within this extracellular matrix or goo of the tissue, kind of suspended with collagen fibers and chondrocytes, elastic fibers. There's 3 types of cartilage in the skeleton. First type is hyaline cartilage, so this is by far the most abundant. It's also going to be the basis for the bone development in utero. Hyaline cartilage provides support, flexibility, and resilience. It's found in the joints or the articulations of the body at the ends of the long bones, as well as the costal cartilages of the ribs, the larynx in the respiratory tract, and the tip of the nose. So all of your hyaline cartilage here are shown in blue. Elastic cartilage is similar to hyaline, but it just contains more of those elastic fibers. So we find elastic cartilages shown in green in the external ear and the epiglottis. So the epiglottis is just a flap that kind of flaps down to cover the trachea, the windpipe, to make sure food doesn't go down the wrong hole. Fibrocartilage, shown in red, is the most durable type of cartilage. So remember from Chapter 4 again, we said you find this type of cartilage typically in places that are subject to a lot of weight and compressive forces. So they have thick collagen fibers and the greatest tensile strength. So we find fibrocartilage in the discs or the menisci of the knee, as well as the intervertebral discs in the vertebrae. There are 7 important functions of bones. One being support, so it just helps to keep our body upright and maintain its shape. Protection is another function, so the skull helps protect the brain. The rib cage helps protect your vital organs. Movement is another function, so the bones, the skeletons, serve as levers for muscles to act on. Number 4 is mineral and growth factor storage. So calcium, phosphorus, and some other growth factors can be stored within the bone tissue. Blood cell formation is another function of bone. So the process of blood cell formation is called hematopoiesis. This occurs in the red bone marrow cavities of certain bones. Another function is fat storage or triglyceride storage. So we use fat for energy, and we can store excess fat nutrient reserves in the yellow marrow, kind of in the hollow core of the long bones. And finally, hormone production. Some bones can produce a hormone osteocalcin just to help regulate insulin and glucose levels as well as metabolism. So there are 206 bones in the human body. So for lecture, we won't focus on naming and learning all of the bones. You will do that in lab. But we can divide the skeleton into 2 basic groups. So the axial skeleton is the head and trunk region, so kind of the central long axis of the body. The appendicular skeleton consists of the appendages, or the limbs, the arms and the legs. Bones can be classified based on their shape. So generally, bones are going to fall into one of 4 shape categories. Your long bones are longer than they are wide. So basically, all of your limb bones will fit into this category. Short bones are shorter and more cube-shaped. So these are commonly found in the wrist and the ankle, so the carpals and the tarsals. Sesamoid bones are a special type of short bone. So it's a short bone that is suspended within tendons. So the patella or the kneecap is an example of a sesamoid or a sesame seed shaped bone. Flat bones are thin, flat, and maybe slightly curved. So these include the sternum or the breastbone, the scapula or the shoulder blades, the ribs, and most of the skull bones would be considered flat bones. And then finally, irregular bones that have complicated shapes that don't really fit nicely into these other 3 categories. So this would include your vertebrae and the hip bones or the coxal bones. So looking at bone structure, we said that organs are made up of different types of tissues working together. So bones are considered organs because they contain different types of tissue. So obviously bone or osseous tissue is the primary, but it also contains nervous tissue, cartilage on the ends of the bones and within the osteocytes, connective tissue on the outside of the bone, as well as muscle cells and epithelial cells within the blood vessels in the bone. So we'll look at gross anatomy and then move on to microscopic. So there's two main textures of bone, spongy and compact. So compact bone is a very dense outer layer on every bone, and it appears smooth and solid. So the cells are more compact in this tissue. Spongy bone has more of a honeycomb type texture. So it's made up of small little needle-like or flat pieces of bone called trabeculae. So all of these open spaces, this spongy texture, will be filled with the red bone marrow. We said red bone marrow was where all blood cells are formed. Short, irregular, and flat bones consist of thin plates of spongy bone that are kind of sandwiched between compact bone. So the periosteum is the connective tissue layer that's covering the outside of the bone and helps to serve for muscle, tendon, and ligament attachments. And the endosteum is going to line the inner cavity of the bone. So bone marrow will be scattered throughout that spongy bone. It doesn't have a defined marrow cavity like we do with the yellow marrow in that medullary cavity. And then hyaline cartilage will cover the areas of the bone that are part of a movable joint, just to reduce that friction of the bone ends as they move across one another. Looking at the structure of a typical long bone, so all long bones have a shaft or a long portion called the diaphysis. And they have two ends called the epiphysis. So remember, epi just means above, so like when we talked about the epidermis. So the epiphyses are going to be on the ends of the bone. So you would have a proximal epiphysis, right? So this would be the head of the humerus that would join with the shoulder, and a distal epiphysis that's going to join and form the elbow joint. The diaphysis, the tubular shaft, is going to form the long axis of the bone and surround that central hollow medullary cavity. So in adults, this medullary cavity will be filled with that fatty yellow marrow. The epiphyses are more spongy bone texture. So they have an outer layer of compact bone, but internally they have the spongy bone arrangement, and they will be filled with that red marrow. The articular cartilage is a thin covering of hyaline cartilage to reduce friction between the bones at the joints. So in between the epiphyses and the diaphyses, we have what's called the epiphyseal line. So in adults, this is just a solid line of bone, but in children, it's still cartilage. So we said the skeleton is originally cartilage that is gradually converted to bone. So this is where long bones will grow from. So children, they're still growing, so they still need that cartilage that will gradually turn into bone. But as adults, this epiphyseal line will close and become solid bone. So this is how they can estimate the age of a body when they find it. They look for that epiphyseal line. So if it's still cartilage present, then we're dealing with a young person. If it's solid bone, then we're dealing with an adult. Hematopoietic tissue in bone is just blood cell forming tissue. So whenever you see poetic or poiesis at the end of a word, it just means the formation or forming. Hemato means blood cell. So all blood cells are derived from the red bone marrow. We said red bone marrow was found within that spongy bone, the trabeculae, or those little pores and holes within that spongy bone texture. In newborns and infants, the medullary cavities as well as their spongy bone will contain red marrow. However, as adults, red marrow will be limited to the axial skeleton and the ends or the epiphyses of the long bones. Bone markings are sites of muscle, ligament, or tendon attachment on the external surface of the bone. Some areas involved in joint formation or conduits and channels for blood vessels and nerves to run through. So again, for lecture, you're not going to have to learn all of the names of the parts of the bones, but this will come in handy for lab. So you not only need to know the names of the bones, but you will need to know a lot of these bone markings. So there are some bone markings that are projections that are typically going to be sites of muscle and ligament attachment. You can also have bone markings that are surfaces that help form joints to allow the bones to fit together more nicely, as well as depressions and openings for blood vessels and nerves to pass through. For example, whenever you see the word foramen just means a hole, whereas meatus is more of a canal-like passageway. So getting into the microscopic anatomy of bone tissue, there are 5 major cell types that we see in osseous bone tissue, each of which has its own specialized role and function. So we have osteoprogenitor or osteogenic stem cells, osteoblasts, osteocytes, bone lining cells, and osteoclasts. Osteoprogenitor cells, also called osteogenic stem cells, are mitotically active in that periosteum and endosteum, so the outer and inner linings of the bone. So whenever they're stimulated, they can differentiate into bone-forming cells or bone lining cells. And some will remain as those stem cells to make new bone cells in the future. So whenever you see progenitor or progeny, it means like offspring. And genic means like genesis, so the beginning or formation of. So these are all beginning to form other bone cells. So all of our bone cells will be derived from these stem cells. Osteoblasts are bone-forming cells that are going to secrete the bone matrix. Remember we said in chapter 4, whenever you see blast at the end of the word, that means that we're dealing with the immature or the forming type of cell. Osteocytes are your mature bone cells that no longer divide and are going to work to help maintain the bone matrix. These osteocytes are found within the lacunae, or these tiny little cavities within the osteon, the bone structure. So osteocytes help maintain the bone matrix by responding to different mechanical stimuli, such as increased force or weight, or even weightlessness. So one issue that astronauts may have if they're in space in an anti-gravity environment for a long period of time is they can come back and lose a lot of their bone density because their bones have not been subjected to that mechanical stress or those forces of their weight. Osteocytes are also able to communicate with other bone cells, so bone remodeling can occur. The bone lining cells are flat cells on the surface that maintain the periosteum and the endosteum. So we said the periosteum was lining the outside of the bone surface. The endosteum is going to line the internal cavities of the bone. Osteoclasts function in bone breakdown or resorption. So again, whenever you see clast at the end of the word, then we're dealing with a breakdown cell. So these osteoclasts have kind of this ruffled border just to increase their surface area for their enzymes to break down that bone. Compact bone is sometimes referred to as lamellar bone because it's made up of lamellae, or these rings of bone tissue. So compact bone consists of osteons, sometimes referred to as a Haversian system. So kind of one tree trunk. So if we were to cut down a tree, and you have the tree trunk with the rings, one tree trunk is one osteon. Compact bone also contains different canals and canaliculi for blood vessels and nerves to run through, as well as interstitial and circumferential lamellae. So the lamellae would be the individual rings in the tree stump. So an osteon is the structural and functional unit of compact bone. It consists of elongated cylinders or tubes within tubes that are going to run parallel to the long axis of the bone. So in a sense, they act as these tiny little weight-bearing pillars that give the bone a lot of its strength and durability. So one osteon cylinder consists of several rings of bone matrix called lamellae. So I always use the analogy of tiers on the wedding cake. So you have a 3-tiered cake. Each tier or level of the cake is one lamellae. Or if we were looking at it from the other view, right, each ring in the tree stump is one lamellae. So each layer of the lamellae contain collagen fibers that are going to run in opposite directions. Right? So this layer, they're running counterclockwise, and in this layer, they're running clockwise. So this is just going to add some extra strength and durability to the bone tissue to help withstand stress and twisting forces. The central or Haversian canal is going to run through the central core of the osteon. Right? So it will contain the blood vessels and nerve fibers. Perforating or Volkmann's canals are going to run perpendicular to the central canals. So they're going to connect all of the blood vessels and nerves between the periosteum, the medullary cavity, and the central canals. So this is why these are sometimes referred to as communicating canals, because they allow the different blood vessels and nerves to still be able to communicate with one another. Lacunae are the small cavities between the lamellae where the osteocytes live. Right? So those mature bone cells that help maintain the matrix are found in these little spaces between the lamellae. Canaliculi are small canals that allow the lacunae to be connected to one another so they can still communicate. So these osteocytes are still able to communicate with one another. So I like to use the analogy of looking at this. It looks kind of like a spider with the spider legs. So the lacunae would be the spider body, right, with the osteocyte in it, and the canaliculi are all of the little spider legs that are coming off. Interstitial lamellae are not part of the actual osteon. So these are just kind of space filler lamellae and osseous tissue. So see, they're not actually part of that circular osteon structure. Circumferential lamellae run the circumference of the osteon structure. So they are part of that tree stump. So looking at the microscopic anatomy of spongy bone, it's much less organized than our compact bone. So it does not contain any osteons, but it does have the trabeculae to help withstand stress. The trabeculae act like cables on a suspension bridge and help confer strength to the bone. So again, no osteons are present, but they do contain some irregularly shaped lamellae, and they still do have the osteocytes, osteoblasts, and osteoclasts.